So I'd like to gavel in and come to order. It's Wednesday, October 4th, just after 11, and this is the Assembly Public Safety Committee meeting. I did put out on the website and on the agenda that we're not going to be taking public testimony today. We did a full public testimony on Friday, and that was very informative for us and interesting. We had intended to have some time to do what we'd like to do today, which is get a new draft of this resolution. But we do want to hear public testimony. In fact, so much that we've set aside a whole time on Saturday from 9 to 1 at the Lusac Library for anybody who's here and wants to testify. So there was one on Friday. There will again be on Saturday from 9 to 1
at the Assembly Chambers.
At the Assembly Chambers at the Lusac, and that's a work session of the whole that Chair Trainey will be presiding over, and we'll hear all of your comments. So we're not trying to shut it down at all, but we just wanted to carve out some time to actually look at and have a discussion of the language. Senator Dyson is not here, and he'd given me some draft changes. Why don't I go through, and what you have before you is a slightly altered, but
Can we do the roll call?
Oh, let's do that. You're absolutely right. So starting here.
John Middleton.
Pete Peterson. Forrest Dunbar.
Felix Rivera. Christopher Constant.
Eric Croft.
Dick Trainey.
Tim Steele.
Suzanne LaFrance. Amy Bosky.
And Amy, do you know if he's very interested in this. Is he going to be able to make it? Do you know?
I haven't heard from Fred, so I'm not sure if he's in town or if he's not.
And then Chief Dahl, did you?
Dahl.
And I talked to the municipal prosecutor again this morning. I've been talking on a number of these issues. I think she's going to make it. She may just be running late. More for having both Chief Dahl and Ms. Thino as a resource if we have questions about why things are there or what the prosecutors or the police need on this. So I'd like to start with this before you is sort of a minimally edited, if you will, version. That is from some comments that I'd clearly heard, and I'm sure there were more that we're going to discuss today, that people had said take out reverse in the title, take out at least one of the proven correct, the proven correct, that we can still debate the clear wording. So that one, whereas a lot of people had problems with a typo on public safety, that was just a repeat of public safety. Those are on the front. And then from a number of you, the idea that the fundamental issue is that we need the probation and treatment and reentry services either on the front end or coming soon if any of this is going to work. So I added that as the first thing we say. And but I know there were a lot of other concerns, questions. So I kind of wanted to do things that seemingly everyone had agreed on, and then but this isn't meant to be the sort of the last version on it. I'd like to take this, the comments, questions, amendments today, and make a new draft that has now had a lot more input that we will then have copies of on Saturday when people want to testify.
So I have a question about process.
Mr. Constant.
Was this introduced or will this be introduced, and what's the process for that?
I had frankly, so it was my mistake, thought that it had been before, and Ms. Domboski was right. We'll introduce it on the 10th. There have been a number of, I'll explain that in a second. There dueling legal opinions about whether a resolution needs 2 readings or 1, but I think it's just as good and appropriate to have it be on the 10th, and then the 24th, as I think Ms. Domboski said, but maybe others, is right as they gavel in, so it's not like that's really losing us any time. So there does seem to be some opinion that you can do this all in one meeting. There's some pushback on that. We might as well just do it right and do it on the 10th. And I think the first 2 pages you have are repeats. What I tried to send, and I think it was confusing to send it, is a track changes version, and I think that follows later. But basically using that front page, which is then repeated, 2 pages, and the changes are in red. Still hoping to get Mr. Dyson, but maybe.
I just have a Scrivener's
Yeah.
suggestion on your new whereas. I believe it should read savings through reduced prison population.
Okay. Would the committee like to go through it line by line or amendments as proposed? What do people
It's not that
think?
big line by line, it's mine, we're sharing, it's up to you.
This is a work session. We're a little less formal. I'd still like to recognize people just to keep the order of the thing, but we don't otherwise have to stick to a whole bunch of procedural niceties.
I do have one last process question,
Yeah.
and this is more about the committee rather than the resolution. I was hopeful that we were going to get our regular update from the chief on crime stats and kind of how things are going. Is that going to be part of this meeting still?
Yeah.
Okay, he doesn't. Okay, he's shaking his
I
head.
actually hadn't intended to do a big stats update, but I did have some information on some action that we're taking
Right.
as a result of some of the stuff we have been talking about.
Thank you.
Mr. Trainee.
Chief, I've got a few questions for you, and I can wait till you're done if you want, or I can ask you now.
I jumped into 91. Why don't, Chief, I know you had an announcement of some changes you'd made to address some of these issues, so why don't we do that, get the questions out of the way, and then we'll go line by line. No, that's good. I missed my own agenda.
Okay.
Yes, the floor is yours, sir.
I appreciate that. So yesterday we started talking about some of the things we're doing internally at APD. We've sort of been discussing it, and I think we've discussed it with the committee a couple times that we had some plans. And so we're finally in a position where we can start rolling some of that out. Primarily that's due to the fact that we have a bunch of new officers in training that are about to complete that training, and so that's why this is happening now. But it also is timely, obviously, since there's a lot of concern about crime in the community. We're doing a little bit of reorganization. If you're familiar with APD, and I think a lot of you are, you know that APD is organized into divisions with a captain in charge of each division, patrol division, detective division, admin, crime suppression. We're moving the vice unit from the detective division to the crime suppression division. It doesn't change those detective status as detectives, but we're trying to streamline that chain of command and reduce any sort of bureaucratic obstacles to actually getting their job done. Vice, of course, has primarily been focused on some of the longer-term drug investigations. They're going to work in crime suppression with the CAP team, and as we talked about earlier this year, the CAP team has, or at least a portion of the CAP team has been refocused on working kind of street-level drug crimes, in addition to some other things. So we want that relationship to be pretty good and have them basically fall into the same chain of command, so the handoff of cases and working together can happen a little bit more smoothly and not have too many commanders involved in the mix. We're also taking, we have a detective that's assigned to the Alaska Information Center, which is the Joint Information Center run by Alaska State Troopers. That detective is traditionally reported to, you know, a portion of the detective chain of command. That detective is still going to do that work, being our primary liaison with the Alaska Information Center. But that detective is also going to report to the crime suppression chain of command and be a little bit more embedded with those units that are working street level crime. For a couple of reasons. One, we want to be able to use the intelligence that we're getting, and also the crime analysis data, which which we've been sharing with you all over the last few months, to generate essentially targets for those units to focus on. I think that it's something we've talked about. It's not a big surprise to most people that we feel like there are a relatively few number of people engaging in a pretty significant chunk of the crime that we're experiencing around town. We want to make sure that we're able to link those cases together and effectively target sort of our worst offenders. So that change is happening as well. Again, that person's still going to be a detective. A lot of his job function won't change, but just the way he reports and the way that he's able to interface with those other units, we think is going to be improved. We've also created or taken a group of patrol officers and given them a temporary duty assignment into the crime suppression division in something that we're calling the investigative support unit. And really, the whole purpose of that group of people, it's 8 officers and a supervisor, is we want there to be a ready group of folks that are available and can respond when the homicide unit has concluded a case and obtained arrest warrants for somebody. They can go out and find that person. Or if the robbery assault unit is looking for witnesses in a case and trying to track those folks down, they have somebody that can help them with that. It's basically just to support all these other units' investigations. When Vice is working a case and requires some extra bodies for surveillance, we just have a ready pool of people that we can go to provide that assistance. That's not tied up doing other things. And then on top of all that stuff, when they're not otherwise tasked, they're also a group that can go out and provide high-intensity patrol. So when we do identify kind of a hotspot location, whether that's a place where, say, we're recovering a lot of stolen vehicles kind of over and over again, or it's something that's being reported as a drug house or whatever it is, we have a group that can go and focus specifically on that spot and really just do high-intensity patrol, have a lot of contacts with people moving through the area, and identify people that are engaged in illegal activities. So we think that those things together are going to be a real successful model. We're going to do this. Those of you that know me well know I prefer to do things, and so we're going to do this and see how it works out. We're going to monitor it, the chain of command. Captain Vandergrift, who's stashed back in the audience somewhere, is the captain that's going to be in charge of this. We're going to actively monitor their activity. There's no single magic number that's going to prove or disprove the effectiveness of this, but we're going to look at their activity in total and see if we feel like it's having the desired effect. And if it's not, then we will come up with another idea and execute that and learn from what we're doing now. So that's kind of the overall nutshell of what we're doing. And I don't think I missed anything in there, but essentially, if you kind of boil it down, we just want to be a little bit more proactive in our approach to some of these things, some of the issues that are coming up in the community, and a little less reactive. And as a result, hopefully have an effect on those crime trends and also kind of relieve patrol from some of the burden it's seeing, free them up to do other things, which I think we all want them to do as well. So that's pretty much it.
I'd like to recognize that the municipal prosecutor, Ms. Seneca Pino, has joined us, as well as Assembly Counsel Dean Gates. Available for questions, I have Mr. Trainee and then Mr. Weddles.
Thank you, Chairman. Chief, yesterday I had taken one of my cars into the Hyundai dealer on Old Seward Highway for some repair, and I got jumped for about an hour with people who had complaints about theft. Apparently, an Enterprise Activities car that was there for repair was stolen at the Hyundai dealer, was stolen.
Okay.
And rather than APD calling, Enterprise called and said, we've got the car. And when they brought it back to the Hyundai dealer, I guess do whatever they're going to do, it was full of keys. Why didn't APD pull the keys out of the car? They said there was a machine in there for making keys or electronically providing keys. And there was also a cell phone that had been stolen. And they were getting calls for another week from Hawaii with Polynesian accent. Why does APD not go through the cars, was a question to me, and take out what's obviously stolen? They just gave it back to the dealer without looking at the cell phone to figure out where the calls are coming from. And so I told Phil, the service manager, I would ask you.
Okay.
And I can give you his number and you can talk to him.
The answer to that question is, first, I don't know anything about that case.
I know, but that's the reason I...
So, second, we do take all the stuff out of stolen cars. In fact, I just had a discussion with Day Shift this morning about that. We take enough property out of stolen cars that the property and evidence section is very concerned about their ability to store all of it. And they're afraid that at some point we might not be able to close the door to property and evidence anymore because they're so full. So we do take that stuff out. I don't know with that specific case why that happened. I'm not 100% clear on exactly how that went down, so I'm not sure even if we got called for that, it doesn't sound like.
Could you give Phil, the service manager, a call, or have somebody give him a call? I'd at least like to close the loop on this. He's the service manager there at the Hyundai dealer on Old Seward Highway. And they actually had put another post up to stop people from stealing cars out of their lot.
What's his number?
Number is 562-5130.
Now it's on the record.
That's his office number, so it's fine. It's not his personal number.
Okay, yeah, we can check into that. But
I'd appreciate it, Chief.
ultimately, I mean, we do take all that stuff out of the cars. Which
That's what I want to make sure is
sometimes
done.
problematic, but it just needs to be done, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Weddleton, then Mr. Constant, and Mr. Dunbar.
I have two. I got one question like that, and another one, but I'll start with the other one. So, Seward Highway.
One I could see it. Three.
It's going well so far. I mean, we've only been at it for a few days, but we've had some experience down there previously through highway safety grants, so it's not totally new. And we were able to kind of use that as a template for what we're doing. I believe Day Shift has a couple of folks down there today. Each of the shifts is sort of approaching it a little differently, but that's a good thing. The traffic is different at different times of day, so they're sort of taking their experience and applying it to that. So far it seems to be going well.
Is it true they cover their costs by the fines that they get? So second, I was driving down Arctic yesterday, and there was a truck on top of a SUV and an Arctic right next to the gas pump.
I have a picture.
SUV,
I have a
on
picture of
purpose
it.
or
No, it was upside down, not on purpose. And then I saw it was
Tudor and Arctic.
interesting, so I stopped to look, and so I said, yeah, it's been an hour, no APD. And then I read online somewhere that APD said, oh, we weren't told it was a crash, so we didn't come. I mean, this seems odd, given that we have 200 crashes per snow every year.
There was no 911 call for that crash?
There was no 911.
There's a single car.
There was a lot of complaining about the police not being there, though.
Which is interesting. But yeah, I mean, well, at the end of the day, like, we do need to get called, and just, I mean, like you did, where you see something interesting and stop. If a patrol officer sees that, chances are good they'll probably stop and look into it. But if we don't get notified that there's an issue, it's hard to respond to it. So
The TV station was very odd.
that is very odd.
Drove by as it happened.
Although we've had a couple recent incidents of TV stations responding to things and then calling us. So I would appreciate phone calls if people find things that they think the police would be interested in.
The owner might not have wanted the ticket. You're out of order. Mr. Constant.
Amy's got her hand up.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I know you probably can't talk too much about this, but I have received a flood of calls in the last 24 hours about what am I going to do to help this guy named Floyd.
That's not, I mean,
I'm just
it's not
curious.
for APD really to address.
Okay, so it's out of your hands, and
That's my thing.
yeah, okay, fair enough.
What are we going to do with Floyd, Ms. Thuna?
Well, it's really the issue is at the core of it is this kind of vigilante thing that seems to now be growing. And in fact, we had someone here at our meeting the other day, the guy with the glasses on, who was pretty much explicating the vigilante process he's involved in. I don't know if they're the same or different, or the APD has any sense of how that's going.
Well, I'll tell you the same thing that we've said a couple times recently, which is we get a tremendous amount of information from the public, tips on crime, spotting stolen vehicles. All of that is hugely beneficial to the police department. And I think we've highlighted a couple times recently where it's been key in some of the investigations that we've broken. So I definitely want to encourage the public to do that. You know, having Anchorage residents go and pursue criminal suspects and stuff like that, we don't encourage that for the simple fact that we just don't want anybody to get hurt over a property crime. I mean, it's just not worth it. And so definitely call and tell us, give us the information that you're seeing. But as far as getting into like a pursuit of another vehicle, not only are you potentially risking your own safety, but you're risking the safety of the people around you, but potentially creating some pretty significant civil liability for yourself as well, which I think is, you know, people maybe don't think about, but, you know, could be tremendously problematic. So we don't encourage people to do that.
Thank you. I agree.
What is going to happen with Mr. Floyd or Floyd? Can you tell us?
All
or-
I can say is that there is an open case.
Right. Never mind. I have Mr. Dunbar and then Mr. Bosco.
I'm good. Take me out, you guys.
Ms. Dumbosk.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you for talking with us today. With respect to, this new organizing structure, a lot of what I'm hearing you say is it's a way for APD really to focus their resources to follow up on crime statistics and all that kind of stuff. So that seems to be quite reactive, but at the same time, what I'm also hearing you say is, well, if we chase these down, our goal is thinking, a small group is committing a large amount of crime. So that's the proactive part, is basically taking the ones that are already committing crimes off the street.
Right, yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay, with respect to one of the things I think probably all of us hear the most about is property crimes. So the biggest complaint I get from my constituents is there's so many property crimes going on. They just tell us to fill out an online report and nobody ever follows up. So what's the point? So I'm fearful that a lot of citizens just aren't calling. What is APD within this structure? Is one of the things that you're going to actually be following up on is investigating and trying to deal with property crime in a different way?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, something that we've talked about in this forum before is sort of the sense that even though there's not data to directly support it, there's sort of a feeling that a lot of the violent street crime that we're seeing and the property crime is also tied up in a lot of the drug crimes that we're seeing. And so instead of trying to, pick these things off one at a time, I think if you sort of try to have a more holistic approach to it, I think it will have an effect on that. That's what we would like to see. And if, as we work our way through this, we're not seeing that, then we're going to be evaluating what we're doing and seeing if there's a better way to do it. But, I don't want to try to get to a place where we're just trying to pick individual events and trying to specifically do that one thing. I want this group to be focused on the people that we're seeing over and over and over again, whether it's in stolen vehicles or involved in drug crimes, and really focusing on them. I think that is going to have an impact on the property.
I have moved the
Okay,
one
and
on the street.
one of the things
Driving
clearly
in
is the
a
elephant in the
stolen
room,
car
in my
at
view,
the top of the 10 different
where I
ways.
haven't actually seen it from the
10.
union, but I've not seen
Middle
from
administration
actual
areas.
police
Yeah,
department.
it's the first item.
Are you doing an
Public
internal review
hearing.
analysis? Is there an expectation as you come out where there might be a point where you say, listen, we're doing everything we can, but even if we're catching these guys, we can't prosecute them because of XYZ law. Are you doing that internal analysis now? Are you able to say now, or is it something you're still evaluating?
It's, that's something I think Captain Case has talked about previously about the way we're looking at what's happening with the arrests that we're making. Obviously, the police department is primarily focused on identifying criminal activity and making arrests in those cases where we have evidence to support that. We do have an interest in seeing those things prosecuted, but ultimately, the prosecution of the cases that we create is really not our responsibility. That's something that we transfer to either the prosecutor's office or the district attorney's office. As the consumer of our product, like we work closely with them to make sure that what we're giving them is viable, but they have the ultimate responsibility to see those cases prosecuted.
They do, and I think a core part of your mission is to use the citizen safe. And if you're doing everything you can, and over here on this end of the criminal justice spectrum, it's completely falling off the thread, I think it's your responsibility as a chief to tell us that. And that's all I'm asking. I want to have an unbiased and admitted analysis. And clearly, you're in a point of position. I know it's delicate, but there has to come a point where that conversation has to be made if, in fact, that's the case. And I just look forward to having the candid dialogue and how you find that's the case.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually got a call from a constituent who was asking about the police's policy on pursuit. He seems to think that you need to pursue the bad guys more often than what you've been doing. And so I just thought, since we're all here, what exactly is the APD policy on pursuit?
Well, pursuit policies are generally kind of a hot topic anywhere in the country that you go. The easiest way to summarize a pursuit policy is the police department has a very strong desire to capture criminal suspects, and that goes all the way down to the most brand new recruits that we have that are on the street. And you guys, I think almost everybody's probably done a ride along. You've seen it, like they want to catch bad guys. But we have to balance that against any potential risk that we're creating to the rest of the public in the process. And that is something that that we're constantly doing. We're constantly not just reviewing our policy and determining if it's in the best interest of the department and residents of Acreage, but that's something that officers and supervisors do on the street as these things are unfolding, literally, from second to second. So I think our current pursuit policy gives some flexibility to officers and supervisors to make those determinations. We're actually in the process of looking at it again. It's something that we just started in the last couple of weeks. That's one of those documents that we use so often. I think it just makes sense to review it periodically anyway. And so we're in the process of doing that now. But we do have, you know, I'm trying to think of the best way to summarize it. Basically, what our policy says is we have the ability to pursue people that are criminal suspects, but the officers involved in that and the supervisors that are monitoring it need to balance that pursuit and the risk it creates against the rest of public safety.
Okay, great, thank you.
I have one last question, if I could.
Is it on that topic, or can I put you at the bottom?
It's for the chief, so.
Yeah, I've got Mr. Weddleton, Mr. Steele, Ms. LaFrance, and then we'll come back to you. Mr. Weddleton.
You know, this crime's a big topic right now. And city council, legislators, public hearing or public meeting
State
on,
prosecutor's office in here,
in our
they've been cutting them back.
meeting last
They're
week
at like
too.
30.
And there's a certain segment that
They've
wants
been
to
cutting
do
back.
something. And they're demanding citizens'
About
Bill of Rights.
the amount of people we have, and that
What
was
are
we
the
used to do
rules
that.
for us shooting people?
We don't prosecute,
That's kind of what it
other
boils down
prosecutors
to.
have.
And I think we should make very clear somehow,
Yeah.
what is the law? What can they do and what can't they do?
Well, I think the police department would prefer that that people not be shooting other people indiscriminately in the city. As far as some sort of specific legal breakdown on what the rules are, you probably want to ask an attorney, and not me,
Been there in this.
to get your legal advice. Yeah, I would recommend that anybody that's considering using force during the course of defending themselves from a property crime to be very, very careful that they not do something that end up causing them to be incarcerated and or again face some sort of protracted civil problem that they end up losing all of their stuff over. This kind of goes back to Mr. Constance's question about taking matters into your own hands. We would much prefer that people report to the police department the criminal activity that they're observing and not risk themselves in any way to intervene in that.
Right, I expect we will hear Saturday morning quite a few requests to know exactly where that line is, and we should be prepared, whoever does that, prepared to answer that
Yeah.
on Saturday.
I typically tell people they should ask their personal attorney for legal advice like that.
Do you want to try and tackle the limits of deadly force in defense of property or person, Ms. Lino?
Very respectfully, I'm not going to be giving legal advice on that topic.
I think that was wiser, wise and wiser than me. Mr. Weddleton asked me this, and I did look up the state statutes. It is not as simple all that as you. I think your question wanted it to be, and I understand that. The one principle I would say that's in our statute, in most statutes, you're generally not allowed to use deadly force to protect property. You are only allowed to use deadly force to protect persons, yourself usually. So where people typically get into trouble is using that kind of force with something that is not a threat to them anymore. I shot him running away with my stuff is what you cannot do. But it is much more complicated than that. You can generally to protect you, and you generally cannot to protect things.
And you're not giving legal advice right now.
And I'm just about at the end of any legal advice I'm giving. But yeah, to the extent that you wanted some direction, that's probably as much as should be given. I have Mr. Steele, Ms. LaFrance, and then Ms. Dabowski. Mr. Steele.
I'm happy with what you're proposing. It seems to me that gives you more flexibility, and that flexibility will give you a rapid response. It will give you cross training. It will give you all kinds of things, and so an effective use of your resources is something I'm certainly in favor of, and I applaud your efforts to try and find a better way to do it.
That's the key. I'm sorry, Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chief. In regards to reporting crimes, I've heard from some constituents that one reason why they don't want to report property crimes is because they don't want to have their houses show up on the map. So that's one issue. I don't know if it's possible to opt out of having your specific information there. And second, what can citizens expect when they file an online report for like when their house has been burgled, in terms of realistic expectations for response?
So, good questions. The first one, with regards to like the open data on community crime mapping, the address is not given specifically there, and the location of the little icon is randomized to a certain degree. Obviously, it's fairly close. I mean, it's kind of within a block or so, but we don't put specific addresses out there. I don't think that there's any way to opt out of that. In fact, we've had a pretty tremendous amount of interest and request in having that data made public, so that's why it's out there that way. As far as online reporting goes, like the example you mentioned was burglary and having your house broken into. That's something that's typically not a candidate for online reporting. That's something an officer needs to come out for, and that's how we typically respond to that. Usually, if you're given the option of doing the online reporting, it's because something's occurred that there's virtually no way for us to follow up on. For example, you have something like a bicycle or something sitting out in front of your house, and you go to bed and you get up and now it's gone. There's really not a lot for an officer to do, you know, unless there's something specific. You know, I mean, and this is the kind of thing you can sort of what if death. But if there's some specific evidence to be collected, we want an officer to come out. But if there's definitely not, then the online reporting gives you a couple of advantages. One, you don't have to, you know, you can do it. It's something you can do at your own convenience and not rearrange your schedule to accomplish. You can put the serial number of your item, if it has one, into the system, and that then when we come across it, we know that it's a stolen item, and I hope everybody, you know, takes the time to record their serial numbers. And it also gives us that data point that a problem occurred at that location. All those things are important. But you know, if there is some work for an officer to do, some evidence to be collected or whatever, typically we don't refer those things to online reporting when we do come out.
So if one was referred to online reporting, can we assume that was maybe an error because a constituent in our area is saying that's what happened?
Well, what I find sometimes is, like for example, somebody will tell me I was robbed. Well, robbed to me means something very specific. There's a statute that has very specific elements on what a robbery is. And what they mean is somebody took something off my front porch, which is very different from a legal perspective. And so if somebody says, well, I was robbed and I got directed to online reporting, what I would want to do is find out what specifically that event was, find out what the details were, and then determine whether or not robbed is really what it was or if it was something else. At the end of all that, if it was truly a robbery and somehow that got directed to online reporting, yeah, I'd want to know about that because that needs to be fixed.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Busby?
Thank you. Chief, I forgot to ask about this. I know in conversations that I've had with different officers, especially when it comes to vehicle thefts, there's been discussions about, you know, gang activity. Have we thought about reinstituting, or what benefits you think there might be to reinstituting the FBI gang task force? Do you remember when we had this collaborative thing? It seemed in the past it had been effective, but I haven't heard any discussions about it.
No, that's a great question, and I think sometimes that kind of, during that discussion, that unit sort of tends to slip through the cracks and not get mentioned, but we actually have 3 officers assigned to that right now. And we do work with the FBI Safe Streets and Gang Task Force, obviously every day. That's their full-time assignment. And that kind of information sharing and partnering we do think is effective. We just had a case recently where we partnered with a federal agency on an event, and I think we're going to be talking about it more later today, but we had, I think it was, and don't quote me on this part, but I'm pretty sure it was ATF stepped in and assisted us early on in an investigation, then ultimately assisted with federal prosecution. So I think those partnerships are very valuable, and APD is actively involved.
I suspect it was all those guns that were stolen.
That one was, I think, but I think this one was more recent from last week. But yeah, I think we worked with them on that too.
Okay. My second question is a little bit different, but I think it goes to recent events and effectively what type of procedures, I don't want you to articulate exactly what the procedures are, but I want to make sure that it's on your radar and that APD trains for it. Especially protecting large crowds of soft targets. In light of what happened in Las Vegas, I'm thinking for rendezvous, I'm thinking any place where Anchorage residents and people from visiting communities might gather in large things. Does APD actually train for events like that?
Yeah, actually, we do. I feel like the tactical training we provide our officers is very good, in my opinion, and just based on my experience here, but also talking to police commanders in other parts of the country, the things that we do, the tools they have available. I think for the most part, we're in pretty good shape there. We do actively talk about that kind of response. We have a training program for those type of active shooter type things. In fact, the other morning, my first stop was day shift patrol, and we had a discussion about kind of the what if. Something officers are very good at doing is spending a lot of time thinking about, well, if this happens, what might I do to respond to that? And so, we've had those discussions internally, but that is part of their basic training that they get in the academy and some of the ongoing training that we do.
And I would assume, especially being in Alaska, I would assume you're gonna engage with a population, probably a number of civilians that are lawfully carrying, and in an active shooter situation, determining who's friendly, who's foe. I'm sure that's all part of your training.
Yeah, and the one thing that we always tell people is if you're at an event like that and you see the police arriving or have interaction with law enforcement, instant compliance is the best way to identify yourself as a friend. And so that's what we always ask for. But yeah, that's something that our officers are going to be looking forward to coming to an area.
Thank you. And just to follow up on Mr. Weddleton's question, I'm not an attorney, I don't pretend to be one, but one advice that I give my constituents that are always asking about deadly force, many of the concealed carry classes, if you just want to take the legal part, it only costs like $50. It's a 4-hour class. If you do the concealed carry and you do the weapons training too, it's usually 8 hours over a couple of days, but you can take the actual class, and there's a lawyer there. There's usually law enforcement in that class, and for $50, I'm telling you, I've taken it myself. There's information well worth sitting through.
I had Mr. Costa. Do you still want in?
Yeah. It's really tangential to all of this conversation, but I also received a swarm of communications last night about a scenario that's taken place in an area of law that I'm not sure about, or even if APD is, and that's kind of animals. And with the new state law on animal abuse, there was a dog that was stolen, was proven stolen. The dog had a chip that was owned by someone else. Dog's name is Monty, and the dog was killed by the people that stole it. And so I've been asked to inquire with APD about if we can come up with some kind of conversation about how APD and the community of dog owners can better work together in the case of stolen animals, because this is something that people are noting. So anyhow,
I'm actually a little bit familiar with that one, and I think stolen might be a bit presumptive.
Okay.
And so, we're always interested, obviously, in investigating any theft case. And, an animal is ultimately property as far as its legal status goes. And I am somebody that doesn't have children, just has dogs. Right. So I'm very interested in animal issues.
Yep.
When we arrive at a scene like that, something that we need to determine is whether or not we can prove that an allegation of theft has actually occurred.
Right.
And that's not always as clear as some people would like it to be.
Right.
So depending on the relationship of the people involved and whatever evidence is available, that's not always instantly apparent. And people that have joint property rights in a situation can make that even more difficult.
Yeah, of course. Yep.
I have Mr. Dunbar and then Mr. Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief, so we've been rightly focused on serious crimes this afternoon, but a frequent complaint that I get, or concern I have from my constituents, is about traffic enforcement. Mm-hmm. And we're about to enter the period where it gets a little more critical. After this, as Mr. Weddleton noted, the first snowfall, we get 200 crashes or whatever it is. And I was wondering the degree to which the increased number and resources of the police department have allowed us to reconstitute any of our traffic enforcement efforts, and also talking about data, the degree to which the department works with the traffic department to determine, there are specific roads in my district where people are speeding down all the time, and I often wonder why we don't. Maybe we do, park an officer there for just an afternoon and get, a dozen tickets, 100 ticket maybe. So I was just wondering if you could speak to those kind of efforts.
There would be a lot for an afternoon.
We've got some pretty bad roads.
Yeah, so we do share information with the traffic engineer's office. In fact, we have like a direct portal connection where all of our crash data goes directly to them for analysis, so that is very good. We do still have a traffic unit at APD. We have about a half a dozen people assigned to it right now. There have been times in the past where we didn't have one at all. It's been bigger in the past, but I think as we go forward, that's something we'll be looking at, whether, when and how we want to expand it. But there are traffic officers that are dedicated to just traffic law enforcement. We also have a traffic tip line, so if people have a specific hotspot in their neighborhood that they're like, hey, this is a great place to go and do traffic, we encourage them to call in because they are responsive to that. I was the traffic unit supervisor for several years, and we set that up, and I can tell you that back then, and I'm pretty sure they still are now, they're pretty responsive to going out and looking at areas. When people call and say, hey, I've seen a ton of speeding in my neighborhood, they go and they sit and they look and kind of have that presence. I am ashamed to admit I cannot think of that number off the top of my head, or I'd give it to you, but we can get it to you to pass on to people. But we always encourage people to call in with those. Traffic officers love to go to a new hotspot and find lots of activity.
I have one quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman. So you had mentioned that the APD gives us crash data to the traffic department. Does the traffic department proactively feed any data to APD about their traffic counts, for example, or speeding counts?
I don't know if they do. Off the top of my head, I'd have to check with the traffic supervisor. I'm actually not 100% sure what kind of information like that the traffic engineer collects. Yep. So I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Steele.
Yeah, one last question for me. I'm interested in what kind of relationship you have with MPs, APs on the base, and also do we have a reserve that trains with and that can be called out in emergencies or big events and that type of thing? What's the makeup there? If any.
Two pretty different things, but so we have a really good relationship, I think, with the law enforcement on JBER. Yeah, they have both civilian law enforcement on JBER and also OSI and CID, which is sort of their investigative branches. I think actually we just recently worked a felony assault case where both OSI and CID were pretty heavily involved and had a pretty good outcome on that. So, we just got recently, the Air Force got a new OSI commander who came and met with me at APD, and I feel like the relationship there is pretty good. And of course, we have agreements with them to provide service on JBER. Yeah, memorandums of agreement. Obviously, there's a lot of civilian people that live on any military base, dependents and whatnot, and so they'll ask us for assistance when those people are involved in some kind of criminal activity. As far as the reserve goes, APD doesn't have a reserve, like a reserve officer program like some other places do. We did in the distant past. There are a lot of issues that need to be resolved for something like that to happen, and it actually requires a pretty fair amount of resource. So I don't know that that's something that we would look at doing anytime in the near future, but we do have the Citizens Academy Alumni Association does some volunteering in various different venues, but as far as a specific reserve program goes, that's not something we have right now.
I was just thinking also, you have officers that come through and retire, or officers from outside to move into the area that have that experience, and it just seems to me it might be a resource to tap that you could back things up. I know it'd be a pain just to deal with it in some cases, keep the training up to speed.
That's the hard part, is anybody you put in an APD uniform with an APD badge on is going to be held by the public, frankly, and the court system as a fully trained and qualified police officer. And honestly, if those people are out there, I'd rather they just came and signed up and were employees, because that would be great. We're still recruiting for the December Academy, so.
We've used up half our time, and I wanted to get to the thing that we could not get to Friday, which was actually talking about the text of the resolution. Ms. Thino and Chief Dahl, do we have you till 12:30 or just 12? I'm careful of your time as well. So if there's no more questions, can we get to that? Okay.
Really quick question.
Yes.
The chief, a number of people believe that your traffic unit has quotas.
Thank God.
Could you address that, please?
No, we do not have quotas.
Sorry.
In fact, the direction that I gave the traffic unit when I was there was, I wanted them to make lots and lots of citizen contacts, which are traffic stops or getting out of your car and
Now you know how I feel.
or whatever. I left it up to their judgment as to when to write a ticket, whether they write tickets or not. I'm not that concerned. What I want them is talking to residents and reinforcing good traffic behavior. The tickets are totally up to their discretion.
So moving on to the resolution, yes? Questions resolved for Chief Dahl. That was important. I received some formal amendments from Mr. Peterson, some more conceptual amendments from Mr. Dyson, some thoughts from Mr. Dunbar. Appreciate all of those. I guess I'd like to make sure we get what we absolutely have to get done. Everything was about the whereases that I got, essentially. Mr. Peterson had an addition to Section 2 that was kind of, we urge you to keep talking on data-driven stuff, and that's appropriate. So I want to make sure the things we're asking them to do, we really do have some consensus on, and then we can move into correcting, changing, or considering the whereases. So what I had said at the beginning, or what I had spoken to a lot of you about, is that we need to say something about, we urge you to fund the treatment and probation. And probation is, I guess, is part of 91, and they are working to have some of that hit the streets in January. Alcohol and drug treatment was part of 91, but we have seen a decline in the availability here. So either that didn't come online, or they cut it somewhere else, or a combination of those. So is there any issue with the new language there on Section 1 that says the Anchorage Assembly urges the Alaska Legislature to immediately fund alternatives to incarceration such as alcohol and drug treatment and effective probation services? Seems a basic of 91, yes.
I'd like to see us add language in there relative to them hiring more prosecutors, because if you look at the history of the last 2 years, they've been eliminating district attorneys. And if we're going to be catching these people, the state's got to have something to prosecute.
I agree. Any disagreement on that? Ms. Thino, you said last time that when you refer conduct that is a misdemeanor but can be charged as a felony, you've seen a lot more declines from the state in the last year and a half, 2 years?
Yes, that's correct.
Maybe he's got it right.
Ms. Dimboski?
Yeah, when I read Section 1, the Anchorage Assembly urges the Alaska Legislature to immediately find alternatives to incarceration, such as alcohol and drug treatment and effective probation services. Fundamentally, I think you're going to hear this a lot on Saturday, and I think it's what we heard. Fundamentally, this doesn't sound like what the community wants. The community wants bad guys locked up. I personally want to see these programs, but I want to see some of these programs behind bars, because I think that's where the community will be the safest. So, this is a new type of way we're going through this. I know this is a resolution from you and Mr. Mr. Urquhart. But fundamentally, I have no interest in saving SB 91. I think it's a bad bill. And so, to get my vested interest in developing your resolution that I fundamentally think is flawed, I have a real hard time doing it through the committee process this way. So again, there will be another resolution on the table that people will have the opportunity to either support or not support. And that is to encourage the legislature to repeal SB 91 in its totality. Now, I think there's a couple good things in SB 91. We all believe that treatment is an important component. I absolutely agree with that. But the goal of SB 91 was to reduce prison population. It wasn't to reduce crime. And fundamentally, we have to recognize that. So, I won't sit here. I'll let you go through your work session, but I'm not going to nitpick everything. But fundamentally, I think the flaw here is us pretending that SB 54 is going to fix SB 91, because it's not.
So I do think that there's some that think SB 91 was the absolute way to go and just needs minor tweaks, all the way to what Ms. Dimboski articulated, which it should be almost entirely thrown out. And this is articulating a of course, that still wants to have those alternatives to incarceration, but thinks there were serious problems. I'd put it as not tweaks, not Band-Aid fixes, but that there were serious problems in it that need to be addressed, and that's between those two extremes. Mr. Trainee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, my sentiments with Mr. Busk, because I think 91's flawed. Still, we're not the ones making the decision. The legislators are. I would like to give them our advice. If you don't want to get rid of it completely, then take this track. Because we're only advisory. We're lucky they're even going to listen to us if they do listen to us. So I think we need to go on this at the same time, Eric.
So is there any, we recommend 3 substantive changes at a prior work session. I can have the prosecutor or the police repeat their support for why these provisions are advocated, but we have heard that before. I guess, is there any one of these 3 that particularly people have concerns or questions about? Mr. Steele?
Yeah, I just, if I can go back to this section 1 again, we certainly shouldn't lead with that, I don't think. I think there's a role for incarceration, and there's a role for people to have judgment. And if you're leading with that, you're basically saying we support their move to have these folks out on the street. And so I have a problem with that particular statement as well. That was where I was going.
I heard from a number of people who said just the opposite, which was this is absolutely what you have to lead with, that this is where civil justice reform has been successful. Texas is the model that's most often used, where they upfront funded those alternatives and didn't dramatically change their criminal law. I think they changed drug possession, which they had some pretty harsh penalties for simple possession, but basically did the reforms and got the savings at the end versus taking your savings up front by getting people out of jail and then either having these services or not. So there was a particular emphasis from other members that this absolutely has to lead it, that's the core of the idea. Mr. Costa?
Yeah, I have a different matter. I agree that having it the lead is the best position for it, because I think that's the whole in the implementation. And but I have a question about number C, or letter C there, section 2. The problem that I am hearing the most about is this kind of catch and release of misdemeanor. It's not the felons. And what I understand is the state doesn't have probation services for misdemeanors, that there aren't probation officers, that they're just kind of trying to figure it out, and maybe I'm misinformed. But, and it's not the misdemeanor who is the shoplifter one-time 17-year-old that I'm concerned about. Let that kid go. Give him support and services in the community, or her. It's the 40-year-old committing 17 bike thefts that I'm concerned about, that gets away with each of these over and over time, doesn't ever rise to the level of felony. And this states that misdemeanors for 1 year, this severely limits the ability of prosecutors to enforce probation conditions. And so can we write any language that asks the state to tackle a clearer system for addressing misdemeanors to keep them engaged, get them off the track?
Okay, so what I'm hearing, so we can move on, is there weren't substantive problems with A and B that we've heard. Now we're on C?
At least for me.
Yeah, Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, it's to Chris's point, which I think is a good one, about misdemeanor probation. So correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Neal, but we've never had misdemeanor probation, or what I mean is supervised misdemeanor probation in this state.
I don't know that we've never had it, but we certainly haven't had it for as long as I've been practicing.
Right. So, and as long as I've been familiar with criminal law. So I definitely agree with that concept. I want to make sure that we don't imply by that SB 91 somehow got rid of some form of supervised probation that now we're restoring.
Right.
We would be asking the state for the first time in as long as we can remember that they actually do this. I think it's a good idea. I think a lot of people believe it's a good idea, but it's always been a question of funding. That's all I want to say. I think it's a good idea, but it would require massaging the language in such a way that we don't imply that this is something new.
Okay, so let's be clear on what it does and then have Ms. Neal do. This doesn't have felony type supervised probation apply to misdemeanors. What it says is you capped how long I could hold that time for these repeat offenders at a year, and that causes problems. Then if you don't catch them, sometimes it goes a little slowly. They know you don't have it, for this string of things, it expires in a year. And then when they do that again, you have none of those tools left. But why is this C important to the prosecutor's office in what you're trying to do, Ms. Fino?
For exactly the reason you just mentioned, Mr. Croft. We hold probation and probation conditions over people's heads as the stick to try and gain compliance. And the compliance may be not contacting the victim, not returning to a scene of a crime, a store, whatever, completing treatment, all of those types of conditions. And they can only be held over their head for that period of probation. And that was reduced from, I think we talked about last time, reduced from 10 years down to 1 year, which 1 year you can imagine, quite frankly, isn't all that long. It is most definitely not supervised probation. The way misdemeanor probation operates is that the person is just ordered to comply and to not commit any new crimes. If we find out that they didn't comply, or we find out that they committed a new crime, we file paperwork and ask the court to revoke their probation and bring them in. So it's a very unglamorous type of probation situation. Discussion about supervised is an interesting conversation that I think is worthy of more discussion. But the goal here is just to allow us more time to keep that stick over the folks' heads so that they can fly.
So you can imagine the conditions that she articulated. Treatment, and it took you a while to get through the process, and then you're at 6 months. And if I know your hammer to keep me in treatment expires in 4 months, 5 months, it can mean you don't do it. Or the contact one is you want that to be longer. The don't go back to Fred Meyers where you've been 3 different times and done these problems. And so this urges them to, and we have a specific amendment that backs it up that I can give, but it basically takes it back to 5, so it's not the full 10, but.
I think that was what we discussed last time, was going to 5.
So maybe I can make that clear that it's from 1 back to 5, not all the way back to the 10, but still giving enough time to have that stick have its effect. Mr. Dunbar.
So, Seneca, I want to get a little bit in the weeds on this. With TPCs, third-party custodians, can that be a condition of misdemeanor probation?
No, that's a bail condition.
Okay, so for example, this will impact, because I would think that 5 years of TPC would be
impossible
right.
to do. Yes.
Right.
No, third-party custodians are only used pre-trial for our worst offenders as a bail condition.
Okay, great, thank you.
So with that, as I said, essentially all the suggestions I got were on the whereases. So I'm going to move to them unless people have objections. Yeah.
Question, Mr. Croft, on section 1. If someone did not read the first part where it specifies that this pertains, to nonviolent offenders, someone might read section 1 and that phrase "fund alternatives to incarceration," might think, to Mr. Steele and Ms. Zambowski's point, that we're talking, about felons as well. Do we need to specify further there that we're talking about nonviolent offenders in misdemeanor cases?
Amy's got her hand up too.
Yeah, Ms. Zambowski.
My comment is this. I've read SB 91 multiple times. I've listened to lots of testimony. And I think when it goes to nonviolent offenders, I think the words of Mr. Josephson ring in my ears when he stood on the floor and he said, under SB 91, you have to realize if somebody drives by a house and shoots at a house, that's now considered a nonviolent offense. When we're talking about all these misdemeanors, we have to remember a number of Class C felonies have now been reclassified as misdemeanors. So I think it tends to muddy the water a lot. When I look at a misdemeanor, to me, that doesn't mean it's nonviolent at all. At all. We can have, I think shooting a gun at a house is a pretty violent offense, personally. I think certain degrees of child endangerment could be considered by many in the public as violent.
Almost all our domestic violence are misdemeanors, at least the first
And
one.
so I think there's a lot that are still, a lot of us would look at, would say, this still could be a violent offense, even though maybe it's not classified that way. So it's, SB 91 there's a whole lot in that bill, and I think just by kind of brushing over it and saying it's nonviolent, I think a lot in the public would disagree.
May I follow up, Mr. Croft? And to your point, Mr. Trainee, too, about having an opportunity to influence I mean, we all want to do what keeps the public safe. I mean, absolutely. And, you know, what will help the prosecutors, the APD, put the bad guys in jail. And so for me, it's very important to hear from the folks, you know, who are, and we have on the front lines, to know what tools they need. However, it's my understanding too that it may not be practical or possible to totally repeal SB 91 at this point without creating more problems. So, as someone who's not legally trained, there are some other issues that, for me, need to be reconciled.
Maybe what we mean there is increased funding for these things, not necessarily the phrase as alternatives to incarceration. I mean, and I have Mr. Constant and Mr. Dunbar.
So you raise a good point, Amy, that isn't it possible for us in this document to request that they separate the offenses violent to nonviolent and come up with a track? Because in my opinion, prison is for people who are scary and harmful to us. These non-prison based offenses are for people who irritate us. And so basically,
If that was the case, I'd be in jail all day.
yeah,
That's true.
but I think
I know I irritate probably 9 members of the squad.
Maybe you could just report there now.
Okay, for the 8.
No, we're
Can I walk
supposed
you
to
down?
tolerate the ones that irritate us. But the idea of, is it possible for us to request that in their deliberations they clarify or divide these offenses, ones that are threats to the physical harm of individuals?
But part of her point is they did that, and the division doesn't look appropriate to her and
that's
maybe
why-
some of us.
And that's why I suggest in here, if we can, state that shooting at somebody's house is in fact a violent offense, even if it doesn't hit the person, right? And so that there is obviously some room for clarification in there. I don't know, it seems reasonable to have that conversation in this document.
Mr. Dunbar and then Mr. Training.
Oh, no, I'm fine. Thank you.
Mr. Training.
Mr. Constant, I saw a TV piece this last week where a gentleman was in court saying, I really didn't mean to kill Precious. I didn't know I shot her. I was just shooting at the house.
Yeah.
And the problem is, once you launch that bullet, you have no idea where it's going to stop at. In this case,
agreed.
a lady's life was extinguished by this guy.
Yep, agreed.
So when they play this nonsense, it's not violent. Are you out of your mind?
So that seems reasonable for, at somewhere, whereas or a be it resolved, that we say, clarify the difference between a violent and a nonviolent offense. That,
Mr. Croft, may I
Yeah.
offer something? In my world, I shy away from using the phrase violent and nonviolent for exactly these reasons. I prefer to use harmful and less harmful. And I think a great example of that is significant white-collar crime is not violent in any way, shape, or form, but white-collar offenders are very frequently sent to jail because they do inflict considerable harm when they take money or life savings or stuff from people. So I think if you narrow it down to violent or nonviolent, you end up with these kinds of debates about whether, does it matter if someone was in the house, does it matter if someone else saw the shooting, is shooting by itself violent? So I'll just throw that out there for consideration.
so I would ask then that we suggest the experts in the subject might come up with some language that we might be able to use to tighten that up in our recommendation. Is that reasonable?
Sure. Okay. Now we're down to 20 minutes, and we're down to the whereases. That's progress. Can I hear, and I have some specific suggestions, but rather than going one by one, can I hear from people in whatever order they want what whereases they are most important that they think should be changed? I know, Mr. Peterson, you had specific ones. You wanted to add, while the recent increase in crime started prior to the effective date of most of the provisions of SB 91, well, I think that varies from crime to crime. I've seen some that is true of and some that it is not. You still, do you want to sort of defend that proposition more generally?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there's been a lot of talk as that the passage of SB 91 actually caused the bump in crime. But actually, when we look back at statistics, we were actually already on the upswing when SB 91 passed. And so it's just been sort of a perfect storm, the timing. And so it's put us in a situation where crime ended up increasing. Obviously, that wasn't the plan.
Yeah, well, so I think it certainly has been a combination of factors. Crime is always a combination of factors. I just don't believe you can say that the recent increase in crime started prior to 91. I think that's true of some crimes, but not all of them. Some you can very clearly see a 2016 uptick, and some it was starting before, and some are even headed down, and that's probably because some of the ways we define some of these crimes have dropped off the scale. It's not because there are any fewer, they're just not prosecuted that way. So I'm not yet comfortable with that statement. We can consider it more, or you and I can talk more. There was a whereas that you proposed, Mr. Peterson, on whereas although SB 91 was the result of years of work by stakeholders from around the state, including many positive data-driven reforms based on proven results in other jurisdictions, there are several flaws which need correcting. I guess I don't mind that so much. I was trying to be very, well, yeah, I mean, it's all political, right? But I'm trying to be very focused on, we think these things and we're proposing these fixes, and not either a general attack or a general defense of 91, but more these things do not seem to have worked. But that language isn't that troubling.
May have contributed to, or something like that. Might be
Right.
some good wording.
Are there other whereases that, as I said, I took out the one that I got the most concern about. The warnings about the effects of SB 91 have proven correct. I think they have, but it was, I guess, somewhat argumentative. Are there other whereases that people are particularly concerned about? Yeah, Chief Dahl.
Mr. Croft, I apologize for interrupting. I need to go, but I wanted to say a couple quick things. Mr. Trainee, day shift patrol commander's already reached out to Phil, and so they're closing the loop on that. And the phone number for Mr. Dunbar is 786-8830 for the traffic unit, and the clerk there will take any tips and pass it on to traffic service.
And then we'd ask you to before, Chief Dahl, but and you thought then that at least these three provisions would help you do your public safety job. You still of that opinion? These three things that we are asking in the second part of the resolution be done to 54?
Captain Case has mostly commented on that, but I don't think anything has changed since the last time he has spoken about it.
Great. Mr. Trainee, before he leaves? Or
Mr. Chairman, line 41.
can we let him go, or
Yeah.
is it you want to? Thank you.
It's
Go
just to you.
go do your job.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
We're saying here, whereas SB 54 generally makes positive changes, but has one provision that generally weakens, why don't we just drop the one out and add an S after provision to provisions, because there's other problems with SB 54 than just one.
We're fixing one, but we don't want to say there's only one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't want to give them the audit. Well, we fixed that one. Now we're done.
So you want an S on the end of provision?
Yeah. Because other problems like ankle bracelets. If you cut one off, then you're sent back in to get another ankle bracelet. Makes no sense.
And I primarily focused on misdemeanors because that's what we do here at the Muni, and so where we can have the most value for adding to the discussion. I am trying to figure out what 91 exactly did on car theft that made it problematic. Was that just a rise in car theft? Or are there changes in 91 that contributed to that? And that's because car theft is generally a C felony. I had to do more research, but I'll try and bring some of that back. If there's no more at 12:15, I would entertain a motion to adjourn, unless there's really substantive things that people want to bring up. Mr. Weddleton?
Well, I have to admit, I didn't know this was a work session on this. I thought we'd have a normal public safety meeting. So we're doing this here. What are we doing on Saturday?
Well, yeah, so Saturday is public testimony, but it can also be used for substance. And so my goal really was to get every easy correction to this and get a new draft out that we could present then and have it be somewhat of a closer to a consensus product with Ms. Dombowski's caveat duly noted, but that we could at least have the language that people found most objectionable if it was appropriate taken out, and other changes. So I'll have a new draft of that we can have for Saturday from this.
Good to
Eric.
follow up. License comments here and Peter.
Well, I addressed, I think all of Mr. Peterson's and Mr. Dyson's. Yeah, I was hoping to have him here. Some are in amendment form and some are in very... He has a be it resolved that the judges get off their butt and fix the bail schedule.
That's the best part of the whole.
Okay, yeah. Well, he may mean exactly Who's that from? But I wanted at least to talk to him.
Mr.
And I do have a copy of the bail schedule, which I'll send around, that Seneca got to me so that we can start to understand that discussion. And he and I have committed to a letter, which others can join, to say we would like you to revise it in these ways. I don't yet know enough of what I want them to revise. But
Wouldn't it argue
so I guess no.
do a resolution?
Let me finish that. I haven't closed with Mr. Dyson. Hope to today.
A separate resolution on the bail schedule, because that's a whole other thing. Just doesn't seem right to wrap it into this, but it does seem worthy of the consideration more than a letter to the judges. But hey, look at the problems.
Okay, maybe we'll elevate it to that. Ms. Dombrowski.
The only other thing that I see that's a major factor that's virtually not talked about is I've had discussions with many parole officers that are frustrated beyond relief, saying they have dangerous people that have violated their parole probation multiple times. I'm talking more than 4 times. Nothing happens. And the parole officers are telling me at this point, they said, when it comes to SB 91 with administrative parole and some of these other things, it's just far too lenient.
And SB 91 weakened the ability to revoke felony probation to the extent they can't enforce it. Is your understanding?
I'm just telling you what parole officers have said to me personally. I know of a couple of specific cases where I was contacted, and of course it was off the record because of delicacies. But they had violent offenders that had, this one particular guy had violated his parole at least 4 times, and the parole officer doesn't know what to do.
Is that an email that you have?
No.
Okay. Well, any information that you can get, either glean from that or have them call me so that I can understand what might be addressed in that. Like, I get the general, but I'd like to know enough to maybe address it here. Mr. Trainee?
John, I view Saturday as a chance for the citizens of Anchorage to tell us how they feel about SB 91. Because right now there's no consensus that Juneau is going to move here for the SB 91 hearings for 54. And our constituents want to be heard. And they can't fly down to Juneau, and they can only hold 20 people in the gallery. We can hold 100 or 200 in ours. So it's just, we want to send a video of this down to the legislators so they understand exactly what the sentiments are here. Because we go to community councils. You've heard it at yours, I hear it at mine. And the public needs to be heard by the legislators in Juneau. This gives us an opportunity to send this down to them.
Move to adjourn.
They want less crime.
Motion to adjourn then. Thank you all for participating. We'll see you on Saturday. This meeting is adjourned.